So we're very lucky to have Dr. Rice give the next series of lectures. And he reminded me this afternoon that I was his undergraduate advisor here. And he still managed to have a great career. But in any case, so Dr. Rice is with IBM Research as a modeler, and has spent a lot of time modeling HART, but he tells me now that he's gone on to the important organ, the brain.
Actually, back to the important organ. That's where I started.
Right, that's right. And so anyway, I give you Dr. Rice, and I think we're very fortunate.
Okay. They don't look like they feel fortunate, but that's okay. But you're fortunate that last section's over. That's what you should be fortunate about, because this next stuff's a lot easier and a lot more fun. Okay, so basically we're going to go over a few things here. This first one goes over the basics of the muscle. But we're actually going to start out with a little bit of philosophy, as much philosophy as I can give, which is what I'm going to try to do is give you a bunch of different views of muscle. You know, you're going to get some schematics, which is sort of the engineering view. And really that was about all I got when I took this course way, way, way back. But now, because we know more, I've put in more things so you feel more comfortable looking at muscle from different views. Those of you who are going on to medical school, say, could look at the protein structure, there's histology. I try to put in some of the historic data, but also some more current stuff. One of the things I want you to do is become a critical thinker about models. A lot of this section is going to be about building models. So just think about sort of conceptual versus really quantitative models. When we look at movies, are these things animations or are they simulations? Is there some real biophysics behind it, or is it just nice pictures? And then with models, you have to think about the successes and limitations. You know, almost all of them have successes, but they all have some limitations that you have to think about. So now we're going to start with the big picture for muscle contraction. And this is actin and myosin. So this is the myosin. So it sits on something called the thick filament, and it reaches up to the thin filament shown here. And so this basic concept is of a ratcheting cross bridge. So when myosin reaches out and attaches to actin, we call that a cross bridge because it crosses these two. It's gotten a little loose here because we also talk about detached cross bridges, attached and detached. But that's what a cross bridge means, really. It's this connection here. And so when muscle contracts, this sort of a ratcheting idea is that it sort of myosin reaches out, the head rotates, which generates force or displacement, and then it detaches and does it again. So it's sort of like ratcheting along the thin filament. So this is kind of the big picture of how it works. It attaches, the head rotates. When it rotates, it puts this stretch in this tail region, and then after it does that, it detaches, the head rotates back, and the cycle starts again. So this is the basic cross bridge cycle. So how does this work in more detail? So this is an ATP-consuming reaction. So this is a nice little animation here. So the head's going to attach, it rotates. And so what's going on here with this is ATP, which gets hydrolyzed into ADP and PI. And so let's look over here at these steps. So this is a cycle, so we can start anywhere. But actually where we're going to start is right here. So this is where the myosin is strongly attached to the actin. And this is actually called a Rider cross bridge because it's just such a strong connection. And so when we add ATP, now the cross bridge can detach. And then while the cross bridge is detached, it hydrolyzes the ATP to ADP plus this inorganic phosphate. And actually this whole complex is sitting there. And then the cross bridge attaches, and then as it rotates, the PI comes off, and then the ADP comes off, and you end up back here at the Rider step. So they call it Rider because it's strongly bound, but if you think about, you know, if you've ever say, found a dead squirrel on the ground and realized how hard it is. It's got rigor mortis. Basically, that's because there's no more ATP in the cells, and then all of the actinomycin bind up very strongly, and the muscles become stiff. So, rigor mortis, Riger step here. So this is the cross-bridge cycle. Now, it's kind of interesting because you notice it binds ATP, and then somehow it breaks up the ATP into ADP and PI and stores the energy. So before it even attaches, it's sort of it's gotten the energy out of ATP, and it's sort of storing, and then when it attaches, it sort of uses that energy to rotate. So, if I would have envisioned, I would have thought it used the ADP just as the head rotates, but it's set up a little differently. So, in the first couple types of muscle that we're going to study, which is skeletal cardiac, striated muscle. And the reason it's called striated is you look at it, you can see this pattern, and the striation comes from this almost crystalline kind of arrangement. So in the middle here are these thick filaments with myosin coming off. So basically, on the thick filament, I got myosin coming off on either side. And when the myosin interacts with the actin on the thin filament, it pulls together this sarcomere. So the sarcomere is really defined by this over here, which is called the Z line, and then over here is the Z line. So really it's going to be repeating end to end and also repeating in this direction as well. But this is one sarcomere. And so I should say that the thin filaments are polarized. So as the cross bridges attach and interact, they tend to move towards the positive end. So this is a positive end near the Z line and the negative end out here. So now we're going to take a little bit more detailed look at these proteins. And these are big structures. And again, when you look at these kind of nice engineering diagrams, it all looks nice and neat. But it's pretty complicated. There's a lot going on. And I should say, you don't need to know these protein structures for the test. Again, I put them up here so you begin to feel comfortable looking at these kinds of things. But this is the head region of myosin, and there's also a neck region. Out here is the tail region, which isn't drawn. But here in the head region, there's a place where it binds to actin. There's also a place where it binds ATP. There's a couple of light chains, which we'll talk about. And then this is showing here, as a more schematic view, is that this head kind of reaches out. It actually sort of binds to the side of this chain of actin and more than sort of right to it. And you can see two different views here. So here's the cycle again. So we start here, this is the Riger step, and here it's sort of drawn with these jaws clamped down onto the actin. And so you add ATP, and now the jaws open and they can come off. So once you bind ATP, now the cross bridge can be detached, and then the ATP is cleaved, leaving ADP and PI. And so again, somehow you've liberated the energy and you're storing it. And then once it attaches to actin, there's that rotation of the head, or between the head and the neck, and it stretches its tail region. So this is called the power stroke, and when the power stroke happens, it moves this distance, which is called delta x, this is the power stroke distance. You're going to get to see this again, but again, this is the cycle here. Now, how's this set up? On the thin filament, is drawn in this direction, you have myosin coming off 180 degrees apart. Actually, there's two heads. We don't really know why there's two heads connected together, but there are two heads and two tails connected. They come off 180 degrees, and then you go down the next step, and it rotates 60 degrees, and you come off in opposite direction. So this is 60 degrees rotated, another 60 degrees rotated, and by here you've rotated 180 degrees, but since you're coming off 180 degrees apart, now you get what's called a pseudo-repeat. So say if you're looking from this direction, now you have one coming off your direction, and then you have another one down here, which is the third step down. So really, this is 14.3 nanometers. The one that we care about is this, which is 43 nanometers. So this is the pseudo-repeat. So we can also define this is the axial direction along the thick filament, and then there's also a radial direction. This is showing actin. This is the way it's typically drawn in the textbooks, but really it's a protein structure. It has 4 lobes. Again, you don't have to know this detail, but this is actually what it looks like. So this would be a monomer, and then the monomers get connected into its polymer. I'll show you in a second. This is another view to make you seasick. Spins around. So in the thin filament, so each of these is an actin monomer is put into this polymer, and it's a 2-stranded helix. So it's like two helices that wrap around each other. And then here, each adjacent one is 2.7 nanometers apart, and then on the same strand it's 5.54. But then this is the important one, is the pseudo-repeat. Is when you go 37 nanometers down, you have one in essentially the same orientation. So because it's a 2-stranded helix, the true repeat would be 26 minutes, 2 times this, but there's a pseudo-repeat at 13 minutes. So the importance of this will be later, so you'll figure out why we care about that. So another thing you can do is, this is called decorated actin. So you can take just the myosin heads, and what you can do is, if you take ATP away, it's going to bind in a really strongly, this Riger binding. So essentially what this is that actin thin filament, and every binding site has a myosin head stuck to it. So they're sort of coming off like this. And that's why they call it decorated actin. Now, the thing is, in real muscle, you probably don't have this many bindings at any given time. This is artificial. But this is just one way they've tried to characterize the system. And you have to think, these are protein structures, really down to molecular level. So, you can't just sort of manipulate these things as you like. It's kind of hard. So this is just one construct. So a few years back, I was at a conference, I think it was Biophysical Society conference, and I asked someone if they had any good pictures of actin and myosin. And so Ron Milligan gave me this. So this is a movie that should animate in your slides. So this is showing the head rotation. ADP comes off. Now you need another ATP to come on to detach. Now that's a sort of flash, like you got the energy out of it, and then the cycle can repeat. So this is a really nice movie. Couple of things. It's really nice, but we have to think about what we're really looking at. How well does that reflect the real system? So I would say, does anybody here have any thoughts about how this particular visualization or animation might differ from what really happens? The PI comes off, ADP comes off. Now ATP comes on, you can detach. You can use, now this is hydrolyzing the ATP, and now the cycle can start again. So one thing that this shows, which is not going to be exactly like reality, is that every step proceeds forward, one after the other. And that's sort of a macroscopic view. In the microscopic world, all these biochemical reactions are reversible. So, if one were to think about what would happen, it might sort of be like the myosin attaches, then it may detach, it may attach. It may actually do this several times before it finds the right attachment, and then the head may rotate, might rotate back. Might do that a couple times before it eventually detaches. And say ADP could come off, but ADP could come back on. So while this thing in the real system goes forward in a net way, any given step may reverse. Now, another important thing is that, as we're going to find out, when one crossbridge rotates, it stretches this tail region. And so what you see here really is this, as it attaches, it causes this translation between them. This is the thin filament and this is the thick filament. In reality, you have many, many crossbridges working together. So it's not really like one of them is able to make a net motion. We're going to talk more about this later. But those are some ways that this really kind of doesn't match reality. The other thing that I should say is that really what this was built was from crystal structures. So one crystal structure they knew was basically this, which was a crossbridge head attached in one direction, and then they could also measure this structure, something like that. So everything else in here is sort of just interpolated. So it's nice, but you have to really think about, what is the real data behind these kinds of animations. Now this one is another way that people have characterized the system. Again, it's very difficult. These are protein structures. These are actually molecules. Then you have, this is something called a motility assay. So you can take the myosin and the tail regions will stick to glass. It's just sort of, one of these lucky coincidences that the tail regions will stick to glass, the head regions pop up, and then you can put thin filaments on this, and you're going to fluorescently label them so you can see them. And then you can see them move around. And this is showing just some examples, for instance, of this is thin filament 1, it's moving in this direction here, and it ends up over here. This is a, and I should also say here that, remember, the heads work towards the positive end. So if this is interacting, actually the negative end is the one which is going forward. The head works up towards the positive end. So this is showing thin filaments moving around. You can't see the myosin because they're sitting on the plate and they're dark. But you can see these moving. It's kind of interesting because they take these kind of funny bends. There's probably a fairly random arrangement of the myosin heads. And so as they move, they kind of go one direction. It seems like then they get picked up by another myosin head, and then they can make these kind of funny bends. So anyway, this is one way that you can take apart the system and try to characterize it. You can do different manipulations. But one thing that's very striking about this system is that it's really hard to take it apart and characterize the pieces because altogether it's in this very complex uniform sarcomere structure, and now you pull the pieces out, and while you can characterize something, you don't really know it's exactly like the same situation as when it's in situ in, say, the sarcomere. So let's go to the sarcomere structure. So this is a picture like out of your textbook. This would be electron micrograph from probably around the 1950s. This is really showing what was known since the 1950s. And so this is what the sarcomere structure looks like. So you can see this dark region, which we now know is myosin, the thick filament. These are the Z lines at the end. Now it's a Z line or Z disc. On a flat projection, it's a line, but really these are disc shaped in 3 dimensions. And then you have, from the Z disc, the thin filaments come out. And then they could label these different zones. So this is a more schematic picture here, and it's showing the Z line that defines the sarcomere. The thin filaments are coming out, and then again, thick filament sits in the middle, and when it activates, it pulls towards the positive end, and it causes the sarcomere to contract. So these different zones, the A band corresponds to the thick filament, the I band corresponds to the thin filament, where there's no thick filament interacting, so it's lighter. There's also this AI zone where the thick and thin overlap. There's another important one, which is, maybe not showing. Oh, the H zone is the region between where the ends of the thin filaments are. So this is the H zone. So on your homework, you're going to get to look at this, and you can be very sure that this will be on the test. And this is very easy stuff to understand, so just figure out what these zones are and how they're going to change. So this is nice. This animates For some reason, it takes forever to start, but so there's, as it contracts, you can see how the different bands change. So, a really important thing is that the A band really never changes length. So the other things change, but the A band doesn't. So now, what about crossbreeds? So at the time, this was from 1954, you could see the thick filaments, you could see the thin filaments, and then you could see the attachments, which they coined the term crossbreeders. But they really couldn't see much detail, so they just knew that there was something that was interacting. Now they could digest the proteins, and they could figure out which was actin and which was myosin. So this is showing a little more detail. So let's start here. These are the thick filaments with the myosin coming off. Now it turns out there's these cytoskeletal proteins that run down the middle of this in the M line. So these thick filaments are connected here. Here again is the Z line. This drawing is sort of thin, but actually there's a lot more proteins here in the Z line. And then we talked about the thin filaments. So these are actin, these two-stranded helix of actin. But there's also a protein called nebulin, which runs along it. You see that nebulin is in a way like a template. It sort of sets the length of this. So you have to remember that these cellular structures have to self-assemble. There's no little workman in the cell that set these things up, right? And so there's a protein called nebulin, which helps form this thin filament. At the end, there's this cap called tropomodulin. So in skeletal muscle, there's very fine control over how long that thin filament is. Now this other protein here is called titin. And so it's a big protein which is kind of spring-like. And so it connects here from thick filament to this Z line, and there's another one over here. And so if you looked in cross-section, these are some nice cross-section views. If you're about here, what you see is that every thick filament is surrounded by 6 thin filaments. Every thin filament is surrounded by 3 thick filaments. There's a 2-to-1 ratio of thin to thick. And then you can see if you take different points, and your engineer so you can figure out what this looks like in cross-section. So now titin's interesting because titin wasn't really discovered. If you read McMahon, there's one of the questions from McMahon they didn't understand was, how did the thick filament stay centered in the sarcomere? Because you think about it like, if you got a few more crossbreeders on this side, you would begin to have more pull on this side, and it would just walk its way over sort of to one end of the sarcomere and another. So they didn't know about, one, there were these cytoskeletal proteins connecting the middle, the M line, but they also didn't know there was these springs at the end, which is titin. So when you think of titin, you can think of giant, like a titan. So this is like the biggest protein, I think. It's made of a bunch of immunoglobulin repeats that kind of stick together, glom up together. Another role for it, well, it connects here to the Z line or Z disc. It also runs down along the center of the thick filament. So there's a lot of roles to this protein. So I get my bag. I have a model of it. I should straighten this out before class. So basically the idea here is that these magnets, this thing is too knotted. I might have to do this next time. But you'll understand it. So the point is, this was supposed to be like titin. It has these immunoglobulin domains that have electrostatic interaction, so they want to bind together. But it's sort of in a string, as you pull them apart, you can sort of get like this, sort of like this, but, so it doesn't seem like a spring, but again, in the microscopic world, there's a lot of Brownian noise. So even if it's just 7 units, you're probably going to get pretty good spring-like action. So I'll straighten this out and we can play with it later. Okay. So let's look, and this is in cardiac tissue, which is slightly different. So here's the Z-disc. This is nice because it shows it more like a disc. And you can see that it's this whole basket weave of proteins. Again, and the cell has to self-assemble, so these proteins come together. There's actually some signaling molecules in here. We're not really going to talk about, what they're doing, why they're important. But so here would be the thick filament over here, and then this is titin here. And then there's no nebulin. So remember, nebulin was this like kind of template or roller that set the thin filament length. It's not in cardiac muscle. Instead, there's something called nebulette, which is a much truncated version of it. And I don't know why it's called nebulette. I think it's sort of like cigar and cigarette. I don't know. But it's called nebulette. So I think the take-home message, though, is that in the cardiac, the thin filament length, we don't really know what controls it, and that's a good question, and that'll be a point that comes up later. Okay, so titin is this giant protein. It turns out there's really two of them that connect from the end of the thick filament to the thin filament. So let's pick this place here. So this is when the sarcomere length is 1.9 micrometers. So the sarcomere length is really from Z line to Z line. So you're going to have to start learning these lengths. So 1.9 corresponds to this. So here's where the protein, all the immunoglobulin regions are kind of glommed up together. And this is where it likes to sit. This is its lowest energy. And so it holds the cell at essentially the slack length, the resting length. So if we take a cardiac cell, let's say the cardiac cell, we stick it there, we let it go to the length it wants to go to. It's just 1.9 micrometers. So it's where titin has sort of found its lowest energy state. So if we go this direction where we start to stretch the cell, now we sort of pull these immunoglobulin regions apart, and it acts like a spring. So as we go up, it generates force. Every year my pointer dies. Anyone else have a laser pointer on the campus? Okay, we'll go back to the digital pointer here. So this region here is where you're stretching the spring. And so the other direction is you can go below the slack length, which is here, and now the spring generates restoring force. So it wants to push you back out to the resting length. So it turns out one of my collaborators always sort of yells at the people that generate these plots, because the reality is all you can measure is this positive end of it. This part here is just interpolated and it's reflected around this point. So it turns out there's no way you can force a cell smaller than its slack length. If you try to force it, it just kind of buckles. So the only way you can get it shorter than its slack length is to activate it. But then if you activate it, you can't compute the force of the spring alone. So again, this part of the curve is actually just reflected up from here. And so trying to get you into some of the issues around trying to understand muscle. Okay, so there's a number of components of the sarcomere. There's actually many more, but these are the ones that are important. These are the ones that are going to be on the test in one way or another. You got to know what myosin is. Titin, again, is this big protein. It's a template for the thick filament. It produces restoring forces. It sets the default length of the sarcomere. There's also this thing called cardiac myosin binding protein C, which will show up later. You don't have to know about that now. So you have to know actin, troponin, and tropomyosin show up later. You have to know nebulin. That's this one that acts like a ruler template. It's skeletal only. In cardiac, there's something called nebulette. There's tropomodulin, which is this end cap that sort of limits how far the thin filament can grow. And then the Z-disc or the Z-line. And then again, this is later. Okay, great. So now we've gotten through the basic proteins. Now we're going to begin to look at some properties of muscle. Muscle's complicated because we haven't gotten into it yet, but intuitively now you can turn it on and off, you can activate it, it contracts, you can put different loads, it contracts at different rates. So here what we're going to do is we're going to try to characterize it in ways that are kind of invariant. So you kind of simplify things in a way. And so in this one what you're going to do is you're going to activate the muscle completely. So you turn it on completely. So without getting the details, you can use enough activating calcium. So now you're essentially getting all the actin-myosin interactions you can get. And then you can look at the amount of force that you get. And you get this non-monotonic relationship. So this is here is sarcomere length. It's in a different scale, but essentially you go up in sarcomere length, and there's sort of ascending phase, you reach a plateau, and then you come back down, and then there's this little tail region here. And so what you can do is, that's the total tension, so you can compute the total tension with the activated muscle. You can also then go without activating the muscle, and there's some passive force that you also get. And then if you subtract the passive from the total, now you get the active tension, which looks, again, as a non-monotonic function, comes up, has a plateau, comes back down. So how do we understand that? Well, this is a fairly simple model. This is given in McMahon. And so you have different lengths of the thick and thin filaments. And so why don't we start at the top one? And so the next page is a picture that's a little bit corresponds better to this model. But at the top picture, you're just about here. So you've just stretched out the sarcomere, so you really can't get any interactions between the actin and myosin. So you can't generate force here, active force. Now, as we go from say here to here, as we go to shorter and shorter lengths, what happens is we can recruit more and more cross bridges. So if we go to shorter lengths, we can generate more active force. So that's taking us up this limb. This is actually called the descending limb, but since we're going to shorter lengths. So then we get up here where we hit a plateau, and that comes from essentially at this point where you've recruited all of the cross bridges you can, and then the sarcomere can continue to shorten, and then the thin filaments touch here, and then they actually cross over. And so at this zone here, you've essentially gotten all your actin-myosin, and then that gives you a plateau in force. Now what happens here is you get a double overlap. So now the thin filaments are crossing over, and in this region here, we think that myosin can't form an effective force-generating cross bridge. So what happens is now you begin to lose these cross bridges, so you begin to have fewer cross bridges. And now that's going to take us down, so now we're losing force in that region. So this gets all the way down here to the point where the thick filament now is hitting the Z lines. So I remember as an undergraduate looking at this, sort of scratching my head with what happened there. It kind of looks like it crunched up like, you know, your car ran into a wall or something. But again, I mean, I think this is sort of a problem with looking at things as sort of engineering diagrams, because in this diagram, you know, this is drawn like a solid wall. And so, you know, what really happens here? The truth is, I don't know what happens there. It probably doesn't crunch up like this. Probably what happens is the thick filaments will bust right through the Z line. Because remember, the Z line is a sort of basket weave of proteins. So it may be able to just pop through. And so it's kind of interesting because real cells in the heart, say, never get this short. They really, you know, they maybe get down to about here or somewhere in here. But if you dissociate cells, you can get their sarcomeres like really this short, and then they just pop back. It's sort of amazing. You would think that, you know, it maybe would damage the cell. So clearly what's shown here with this thing gets all crunched up and mangled isn't right, because in the real system it can pop back out and move just fine. Okay, so That was skeletal, and that's kind of the classic data from skeletal. And so I've been interested in modeling heart cells, cardiac cells for a while, and I was trying to use the skeletal data. It just was inconsistent, and so I began to think maybe there's some problems here. And so what I think happens is where the skeletal muscle reaches a plateau, cardiac muscle continues to grow in force. So this would be the force-length relationship in cardiac. So it grows all the way out to about 2.4 micrometers, and then it comes back down. In skeletal, you hit a plateau about here, but this is skeletal muscle, this would be flat, where the cardiac muscle, it still goes up. So this is something that I proposed and published, but to be honest, nobody knows whether this is true or not, because some people just haven't taken the data. And so, why don't they take the data? And I think the problem is the thin filament, probably this length is more dynamically set. Remember, skeletal, you have this template that really sort of locks you into a length. In the heart, this length may vary according to sort of the load that's put on the cell. So we don't know. But if we take these lengths, which I'm going to assume are the right lengths, now if you do the sarcomere length, and this is maximum activated force, you get this kind of pattern. So a similar thing happens out here. So you might notice one thing about cardiac cells. You never get really on this descending limb under normal conditions. So this is a range really sort of a normal heart cell when it's in the heart. It never really gets out to where you see it coming down. So this is what you get. This is one interesting point. Here's where I drew the thick filament busting through the ends of the Z-line. And when this happens, you begin to lose more cross bridges again. So now you're losing cross bridges and the slope here changes. So this was my prediction from the model, but this is the data taken by my collaborator Peter Batum and Hank the Curves way back in 1990. This is showing passive force. Now it's noisy, you're not going to see that level of detail, but you can see how it sort of grows out to about 2.3 micrometers, which is sort of similar. And then this is passive force here. And so what happens with passive force, remember this is a resting length, so this is where there's essentially no passive force. And then as you sort of pull the cell, you get some kind of passive force. In cardiac cells, when you get out to about 2.3 or 2.4, it gets very stiff, and you really can't pull them any further than that. And if you try to, you damage them. So this is really like the limit. And then you also notice here that over this range, the passive force is really only a small fraction of the active force. And so I think the way to think about this in a heart cell is that when the heart's relaxed, you really want that muscle to turn off. So this is so the heart can fill with blood. And then you haven't had any sections yet, we'll get to them. But this is sort of the conceptual idea here, is that when you turn off the muscle, you want it very compliant. So really, as you sort of expand heart cells, they don't fight a lot. And then, not shown here, but if you went down to shorter lengths, the passive force would get negative because it becomes a restoring force, because they like to sit about there. So what generates the passive force? Well, there's two components. One is titin, which we already talked about. This big protein, it sits between the Z-line and thick filaments. This is showing two sets of data, one from mouse. LV is left ventricle, so part of the heart, and then this is from dog left ventricle. So there's somewhat slightly different lengths here because of heart sizes for a mouse is teeny weeny and beats about 600 times a minute, whereas a dog is much larger and beats more like 120 times a minute. So it turns out there's some differences in the lengths here. But the important thing here is that there is one component of passive force from titin. There's another component from collagen. And so the collagen sits on the outside of the muscle, and it has this sort of furrowed appearance or redundancies. So at rest length, it's kind of like this. As you stretch the cell out, you can imagine straighten out these redundancies. And then when you get out to this maximum length of about 2.3 or 2.4 micrometers, now you straighten the thing out and it becomes very stiff. It's not going to want to be pulled anymore. If you do, you damage the cell. This just shows some pictures of collagen and skeletal muscle. So this is the cross-section of skeletal muscle. Again, you're not going to get tested on these, but this is just to give you a little bit better idea of what these structures actually look like. Again, this is another picture. So this is a cross-section. These are muscles. But you can see around muscles, you have a lot of collagen. All this is collagen. Okay. What we're doing good today. This is excellent. Okay, classical lump parameter models. So what's this all about? So these, I think, are, if you think about, it's fairly early on that physiologists could take out, say, a frog muscle, much like you're probably going to do in your lab. Take the frog muscle out, you can put in saline solution, you can now stimulate it, and you can make it contract. I mean, right? Frankenstein, at the time they wrote Frankenstein, they understood that electricity could stimulate muscles and activate them. So physiologists could begin to characterize muscle, and they needed to begin to build a quantitative model of what they saw. So this is one kind of setup they used. So the way this works is you have a lever. This is your muscle. It's connected from tendon to tendon. We haven't really talked much about this muscle structure, but if you have a skeletal muscle, it really runs from tendon to tendon. It's a big multinucleated cell. It's excitable. When you activate it, the whole thing electrically activates. You get an action potential, which you know about, and it causes the muscle to twitch. So here we have a muscle, we have a stimulator, we attach it one side to a solid fixed point. Here we're connected to a lever. We can now put a different load over here on the lever. So when it contracts, it pulls against this load. We also have this catch mechanism. So until we activate the catch, it's at this length, a fixed length. So what this is showing here is that for this kind of experiment, you can activate the muscle, it will generate some amount of force, and then when you let the catch go, you see this length profile, which is probably not too intuitive, but you get this almost instantaneous shortening, and then with time you get this slower shortening. So you get one amount of shortening, which is delta x2, which is very quick, and there's another amount, delta x1, which takes more time and has this kind of exponential decline here. So they begin to come up with a model of how this works. And so the initial model was that you had some contractile element that was generating tension. Then you also had a parallel elastic element, so that is something that generates like a spring that pulls in parallel with this, and there's also a series elastic component. So what we're going to do is now begin to think about how to build these kinds of mechanical models. So the first thing we're going to talk about are these elastic components. So the best model of elastic component is a rubber band or something like this. So it has a slack length, so below slack length it generates no force. So once we get up to slack length, now the force is going to be proportional to the amount of extension you have. So if x is the total length, delta x here is going to be the amount of extension. This is like a simple spring, so it's the tension, it's just k times delta x. So the length is the slack length plus the delta x. You can think of slack length and then the distortion. So, obviously a real rubber band, you're going to get to a point where it gets very stiff, but over a lot of the range, it's going to look sort of like a linear spring. And again, this is just saying that If you go to shorter Mach length, then you get no force out of it. So these aren't really linear elements. Only linear over a certain range. This is from a study from 1958 where they're looking at the tension generated from a muscle, and this is from the series elastic element. So here you extend it by this much, you get this much force. So it's not linear, but it's sort of kind of close enough. Now, if you think about when you put things in parallel, so you had two elements like this, one spring here and one spring there, and one elastic element and the other elastic element. And so what we're going to do is we're going to simply add the forces here in the tension. So we're starting to kind of lose. I mean, tension really is how much something is pulling in. It's the tension. A force is actually, has a vector. It's a vector, so it has a direction. And this is all kind of a little loosey-goosey, but you should be able to figure out sort of the conventions here. But this is in parallel, so this is like we had two of these, and now whatever force is generated is added. So we had like something like this, these are in parallel. So if we had, essentially the tension is going to be kx delta x1 plus k2 delta x2, where there's some distortions. Now, you guys are smart, you see how this is drawn like this, and you would say, well, if this was a stiff spring and that was compliant, these ends would be twisting, but we don't want to consider that. This is just for simplicity. You don't think about, it's just these elements just can move in this direction. Okay, so now we can also have, that was showing two elements in parallel. We can also have elements in series, so that's end to end. So if we say took this one and took that one, and now we apply the force here, then what happens is each of these sees the same force. The delta x here is really the delta x1 plus delta x2, and then so this is in series. I didn't write down, but you can compute the k as 1 over 1 plus k1 plus 1 over 1 plus k2. You get to do that. Actually, I guess it's written here. So for this ensemble, this is k1 and this is k2. Everything's above slack length, and the total would be 1 over 1 over k1 plus 1 over k2 quantity. So you can kind of merge this into one element. Now, what happens is this is sort of looks obviously like you're in series because one connected the other in a series. But you have to be a little careful because you had this situation where you have things fixed at both ends. So now if I fix the ends, give me a hand. Move the center. Okay, turn around so you can see this. Okay, so as you move the center, actually, not so much. Let's get them up there. Try it now. It's actually very stiff. And go the other way. Okay, and so it really, thank you. So it's really as if they're in parallel. It's that stiff. Now, it doesn't look like it because it looks a little strange going like this, but what happens is if you say move this one, this guy pulls more. And then this guy is pulling less, and so the net effect is it takes more force. So it looks like they're in parallel. Okay, so let's get back to this model, this lump parameter model. Okay, so now for this active element, they actually broke it into two pieces. So one is this, which is called a pure tension element. So those of you who took circuits, you can have like a pure voltage source or a pure current source. This is the same thing, it just generates tension. And then connected to that is this viscosity element, usually called a dash plot. So the force of this is a constant times the derivative. So sort of the faster you try to move it, the more that it resists. So this is now part of the model. So then, question I have every year is, what dash pots are in your car?
Pistons.
The what?
Pistons.
Pistons? Other? Got people using those. Shock absorbers? Dash pots. Other dash pots in your car? You got hatchback with these power windowless. These things. Right, basically what it's going to do, it's going to sort of resist any sudden change in motion. You also have in your car this thing's called steering damper. So like, if you can imagine, if you're driving a big heavy car, you hit a rock in the road, it's going to try to turn your wheel. Even if you have power steering, it would just tear the wheel out of your hands. So you have this, and so sort of the more sudden jerk you get, the more force that this resists with. And so it's sort of, handy things to have. This is one that's just on a motorcycle, same idea. So anyway, so you can think about a dash pod. So it's going to resist any sudden increase in velocity. So now this becomes the whole ensemble. This is our lump parameter model. We have pure force element, dash pod, and then you have this parallel elastic element. These are all in parallel. And then some series with this series elastic element. So really the tension of this element is equal to the tension here, is equal to the tension of this ensemble, which is this, and this together. So you just have to always balance these things out when you write the equations. So now, we haven't really talked much about how we activate muscles so far. We were just talking about this length-tension relationship where everything was fully on. In real muscle, you can activate it and you get a twitch. And so this is showing up here two twitches that are far apart in time. This is stimulus 1, stimulus 2. As they get closer together, these twitches will fuse, and then they start to go up in force level. And then this is from the book, so this will be one twitch, and then sort of a slow rate, and then as the rate gets higher, it kind of becomes fused into a constant high level. This was another picture out of another textbook showing what happens when you tetanize muscle. Of course, the problem is you can only keep it here for a while, and otherwise it sort of comes down. Do you guys have to do this lab on the muscle that coming up? Yeah. My muscle did a lot of sort of coming down when I did it. Anyway, so this is an experiment that is a very clever experiment that was done because they were trying to figure out what was going on in the active state, that sort of pure tension generator. So they set up this kind of experimental setup. Now we have the same lever with the catch. There's no load put on it. And what we're going to do is we're going to stimulate the muscle, and at some delay we release that catch. And it's going to shorten for a little bit, but then it's going to stretch that string out. And once the string gets taut, then you're going to measure the force. And so you activate the muscle with the twitch, and then you pull that catch at variable times, and what you get is this sequence of curves here. So each later one gives you a slightly different curve. And so this is the developed tension. And so if you take your model, and so what I should tell you is that in this case what happens is this muscle is going to internally shorten so that that parallel elastic element goes below its slack line. So let me go back here. It will internally shorten, and then this element will go away because it's below its slack line. And in that case, what happens is the total tension that you measure is the tension here in this series elastic element, which is going to be equal to the tension in these two. But if you're at the point where the motion is stopped, velocity is 0, then this guy goes away, and then you're left with just the tension of this. So that's what they were trying to do, was extract out what is the tension coming out of this pure tension generator. And so at this point here, at the peak of force, you can figure out that peak of force, there's no more shortening in the series elastic element. It's stopped, and so there's no change in velocity at the, so there's no velocity at the viscosity element, so it goes away. And then just at this peak, you can read the active state. So the active state had this value. So sort of with time, the active state is gone away in this kind of pattern. And then to be even more clever, this describes this. So I'm not going to go through it. You can read this and try to help you understand the setup here. But you can do this in several steps, and every time you hit the peak, this is the point where you can read off the active state. And also here at the bottom is another place where velocity goes to 0. So for a sequence of twitches, you get an active state. It sort of jumps up quickly and then comes down and jumps up quickly. So there's going to be a homework problem that can help you understand that a little more. So the last parts here are solving one problem out of McMahon. So again, you're going to get this in the homework. It'll be on the test. You'll be expected to be able to solve this kind of problem. So in this case, they've simplified it because this is just the pure tension generator. This is the viscosity element. This is the series elastic element. There should be a parallel one, but they got rid of it to make this simple. And then they're saying this pure tension element is going to have a scheduled force like this, so it turns on in a square wave, it has a flat top, and then turns off at C, and at C plus A, it turns back on, and then it does this, and so it's saying, okay, well, they want you to solve, let's see, what do they want you to solve for? Okay, so they're solving, they want you to solve it for force. I mean, in general, you're going to have to solve for the force or lengths of different elements. It turns out they're all going to be very similar. So in this, the way that McMahon solves this is he writes down these, which is the tension of the series element is going to be K times its distortion. You can have a force generator plus a dash pot. They're in parallel, so you add together those tensions here. So the T is the total tension. And then this muscle is assumed to be isometric, so it's at a fixed length. And so that means it's at a constant length. When x1 gets smaller, x2 gets bigger. So to solve this, what we're going to do is we're going to take the derivative of the first equation. So I don't know why he doesn't say derivative, but you actually take the derivative of the first equation. Then you can then substitute that in here to this equation. And then you take that, and then you can put it here. And this is just rearranging. Anyway, this is a simple first order differential equation. You're going to solve for t as a function of t0, 0, and then setting up with the boundary conditions. So it starts off t0 to 0 at time 0, and then you can solve for, so he just sort of does this and says, okay, here's the answer for you. Draws it out. I mean, if you want to do this by solving the differential equations, you can do it. The way that I'm going to recommend doing it, I've always done it, is that you just figure out what is the time constant. You figure out what is, because you notice like here, this rises with the time constant, this declines with the time constant. It's all just sort of simple, e to the minus t over the time constant. So the way I would do it is if you wait a long time, this thing is going to settle out and stop moving. When it stops moving, the viscosity element goes away. And so, for instance, if we turned on the active element for an infinitely long time, we would see this kind of curve. And so basically, you take the initial value, in this case, which is 0, you would take the infinity value, I'm sorry, get it backwards. The initial value is 0 at time 0. This is the infinity value, is t0. And basically you go towards the infinity value with 1 minus this decaying exponential, and then so the initial value dies out with this decaying exponential. So it's like you're coming up to the final value and the initial value is decaying away. And you can basically do that, so you set up this equation with the t final and the t init, and then you just plug in the value c here, and so this would be the value at time c. And then you can just iterate this in this kind of thing. So if you've gotten up to this point at time c, that becomes your new initial value. The infinity value now becomes 0. You rewrite this as shifting everything over, and then you can write the equation. So for everything I'm going to give you, it's going to be simple. You're going to have one dash pod or a couple dash pods, a couple springs, nothing complicated. All this, everything's going to be these square steps. Anything I ask you to solve in this way. On the homework, there's something a little more complicated, but at least for the test, assume it's always going to be a square wave. I'm going to ask you to solve for things. So you can use this method. The only warning here, of course, is that you have to compute the time constant. You have to figure out whether you are above or below slack length. For instance, where we talked about this guy going below slack length. If this guy's below slack length, then the time constant is going to be tau over k to c. If these are above slack length, then the time constant is different. It's going to be b over kp plus k to c. So just be aware of whether you're above or below slack length. The other part of this problem was to figure out the ratio of this peak to that peak. And McMahon does this in, to me, a kind of funny way, where he draws this curve as a function of A. So the ratio is 1 if A is long. If A gets short, the ratio becomes 1 over 1 plus E minus K over CB. I think a more intuitive way is just write this all together, and the ratio is this, which is a function of both K and both A and C. So basically, the intuition would be here, is that if you allow C to be very long, you're going to come up to the maximum force. It doesn't really matter what A is, because the next time you come up to the same maximum force, the ratio is going to be 1. On the other hand, if C is short, it comes up to some value. A is long, you go all the way back to 0, you come back up to the same value. The ratio is 1. The only time that it gets really interesting when it builds up is when both C and A are very short, and then it can do the staircasing up, which is what you see in real muscle when you do these twitches. So I think part of the question says, does this behavior agree qualitatively with experiments? Well, if you want to look at twitches and how they fuse together, if you have a short A and a short C, that kind of qualitatively agrees. So actually, I think that's the end of the first lecture. I don't think I've ever gotten through this in one time, so you guys are exceptional. So I want to take a few extra minutes and get back to you next time we'll pick up in the second lecture.